While we have people rolling in, we'll just start with introductions. So I'm Leo Bonanni. I'm the founder and CEO at Sourcemap, uh, and I'm joined by Carrie Stalin. Do you want to introduce yourself, Carrie?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Carrie Stalin. I'm a customer success director here at Sourcemap, and I've been working to help our customers implement their supply chain mapping software over the past several years.
And we've got Alexi, one of our team members, behind the slide deck, but we'll be receiving questions through the Q&A in Zoom over the course of this webinar. So please put in writing any questions that you'd like us to answer, and then we'll be taking it from here to a brief overview of what we mean when we say maximizing supplier response rates for supply chain compliance, how we do it, and then some of the important takeaways that we've had from doing this for the better part of 15 years now, specifically when it comes to supply chain mapping for regulatory compliance, both North American regulations and European regulations. I think we have a quorum. So, Lexi, if you could go to the first slide, I'll just give a little overview. We just have a few slides, and then we'll go to more of a back and forth where you can ask Carrie your questions. So, just as a means of introduction, so Sourcemap is the supply chain regulatory software company. This is what we were built to do, especially to raise standards across global supply chains by enabling the kinds of collaboration that I'm sure you all know is needed between companies, their suppliers, and their indirect suppliers. So started in 2011, headquartered in New York, Chicago, and Paris. And really a very, very large, in fact, the largest database of suppliers mapped, a little over 5.5 million today. Yeah, so we have primarily a technology approach to enabling collaboration across global supply chains. We have the only automated cascading so that customers can get identification of their tier 3s and tier 4 suppliers within weeks. We validate all the data, cross-referencing it with satellite imagery or with supplier watch lists where applicable. We trace down to the individual transaction, and we trigger those transaction traceability requests from SAP or other ERP integrations in order to comply with sort of the highest standards of customs regulation, CBP, US forced labor, and right now the EU Deforestation Regulation are the most transaction level regulations. We have coverage for all North American and European supply chain due diligence regulation, and we're continuously updating our platform, our approach with industry best practices so that the workflows are the ones that suppliers are already accustomed to doing for their customers, and to meet and exceed all of the regulatory requirements so that our customers don't get investigated. And then maybe the most important part to this conversation is we have a global customer service team, but most importantly, we have a global supplier outreach team that is really there to make certain that we can handle all supplier communications, everything from registering and training to reminding and supporting and resolving issues every step of the way, not just for tier 1 suppliers, but tier 2, 3, 4, all the way to tier N, to the raw material. And that's what we're really going to dive into. That's where Carrie can bring so much expertise to bear. Next slide, please. As an introduction, so when we say supply chain compliance, we're really talking about the new due diligence regulations in North America and in Europe that require companies to be accountable for their indirect supply chains. We call that process N-tier mapping, which is the process of identifying all the stakeholders down to the raw materials. We see that N-tier mapping, notwithstanding the omnibus, is almost certainly a common foundation for all supply chain due diligence regulations that you see on this slide. namely on the US side, the forced labor regulations, and on the EU side, everything that falls under CSDDD and CSRD, including right now EUDR and the forthcoming battery regulation that goes into effect this summer, but also what we're expecting for the EU forced labor law, various materials and claims regulations as well. So end-tier mapping, transaction level traceability, end-tier data collection, getting more data from suppliers who you may not know already. These are all foundational to supply chain due diligence laws. Depending on the law, you may also need to run supplier watch lists, country risk assessments, or get into specialized mapping of raw materials sources like farms and forests. But really the foundational mapping, tracing the transactions, and getting additional corroborating data from suppliers, they're foundational to all of the supply chain due diligence laws, which means you can use one approach. You only have to reach out to each supplier once to get them onboarded to a process that will satisfy all these laws. So it's a major benefit in that regard. Let me pass it over to Carrie to get a little bit more into the weeds on specifically how we approach the supplier outreach side of things.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leo. And Lexi, if you want to move to the next slide. What I want to first talk about is how you all can ingrain this supplier outreach and transparency mindset into your organization before bringing in a partner like Sourcemap. Suppliers are really the gas that makes the engine go with supply chain mapping, and we have our team set up here to support you in those endeavors, and that's what I'll be talking about specifically next. But first, want to touch on how you can set up your organizations for transparency. I'll go through a couple points here, and then, like I said, we'll move into how Sourcemap can support as well. So firstly, you want to set up your internal teams and strategy for transparency. So this could mean really setting the scene with your internal colleagues and stakeholders. Transparency supply chain mapping touches many parts of an organization. Many of you might be coming to this from a compliance lens, others potentially from a sustainability or ESG perspective, or others from just a resiliency perspective as well. You want to make sure that you're involving all the relevant stakeholders who may have goals for that upstream supply chain visibility or compliance readiness. Getting all of these folks in a room, understanding why it's important to your suppliers, making sure that you all internally understand what is needed and what is important is a first step to really setting the strategy. From there, it's good to take stock of all of the different requests that your suppliers are already potentially getting. We know that suppliers are often getting requests for information, whether it's upstream visibility, compliance-related items, really taking stock and seeing how you can kind of combine and streamline those efforts. And then making sure you're also involving any local contacts who may have that support with your suppliers. Once you have this strategy, it's important to then start to set your expectations with suppliers. From kind of this discovery that you're able to hold internally to understand why this is important to your business, who needs to be involved, what you want your suppliers to be doing, we suggest having a really strong expectation and communication with your suppliers. So this can be really setting a kind of overview of the importance of supply chain transparency. As you're inviting your suppliers to be transparent, you want to make sure that they understand why this is important to your partnership with them. Setting that kind of overarching strategy and alignment with your suppliers will be a really key first step to getting their buy-in. If you're able to, we also really recommend including supply chain transparency goals within any partnership contracts that you may have with your suppliers. This is becoming something that is going to be more and more business as usual. So having that as an outright expectation for your suppliers can really support in gaining those that buy-in and that response from your suppliers upstream. The last piece is really taking a step beyond just your tier 1 suppliers and making sure that they understand that transparency doesn't quite stop with them. What transparency means is full supply chain visibility, meaning that not only they, but their upstream partners should be expected to be transparent as well. This is a really important step to communicate to your suppliers so that they understand that you are overall looking for that full supply chain visibility and transparency. After you've kind of created this overall strategy and alignment goal for your suppliers, the next step is to really communicate and communicate often. Like I said, this is going to be something that is more business as usual, so communicating about it as if it is such is important as well. As you're starting this out, we find that sending an announcement or executive letter from potentially your chief procurement officer or other executives is a really important step to make sure that your suppliers see this as an initiative and a process that has executive buy-in. This can help them make sure that they know that this is something important to their partnership with you and important to them continuing doing business as well. We also recommend providing ample notice to suppliers. This is especially relevant as we think about some of the upcoming regulations where we have potentially a little bit more time to understand where suppliers may be in their transparency journey. Whether that is early communication and often communication about what will be expected and when that will be taking place, or actually getting started with doing some of those mapping or potentially deforestation analysis checks earlier on to test your suppliers, see what questions they might have, see how ready they are, so that you can understand where your suppliers are in their transparency journey, provide some feedback, and re-strategize as you look towards full rollouts. The last piece is that continuous improvement piece. So this, again, supply chain transparency has been around for a while, but it's still something that can be new for your suppliers and for your organization. So having that opportunity to reflect throughout your partnership with suppliers, establish best practices, identify areas for improvement in communication or goal setting or relationships with your suppliers, potentially even sharing and setting benchmarks amongst your suppliers is something that we see work really well in terms of setting kind of those transparency goals and being able to leverage the data that you've collected for that continuous improvement. It's really important to take a step back and understand what you have seen, maybe the first or second time that you have requested this type of information from your suppliers, and then recalibrate, share that feedback back with your suppliers, and really treat this as an open communication with them. They're being open with you and sharing their upstream data, so you want to be open with them as well, and make sure that they understand why this is so important for you all and how they can work with you best to share this information. All right. Well, that was a lot of information about how you all can kind of set up your internal teams for this type of communication and process with your suppliers. What I want to talk about next is how Sourcemap can support you in that, what our processes are, how we kind of fit into this overall transparency journey, and then we can move on to Q&A. As we switch slides, and Lexi, if you don't mind passing over to the next slide, just a reminder that you all can add in any questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be getting to them at the end, and I think Leo's actually already going in and answering some as we talk through the webinar. All right. So after you have kind of set up your teams for success, this is where Sourcemap comes in. So as Leo said, we are a supply chain mapping and regulatory compliance software that is based on supplier reported data. So like I said, the suppliers are such an important piece of this journey to actually get that data back for you so that you are ready for the various regulations, you're able to meet your sustainability commitments, or whatever it may be. Sourcemap has a process where we work with you to onboard your suppliers to our system. We'll start with your tier 1 suppliers, and then we go through a process of automatically cascading any requests to upstream partners. As those upstream partners are discovered through our system, we also engage those upstream partners as well invite them into the Sourcemap software, and make sure that they're working with us to provide and respond to requests. We do this all through our supplier engagement team. Our supplier engagement team is a group of outreach specialists who are able to act as an extension of your organization in terms of supplier communication. So that team will partner with you all to reach out to suppliers, initiate all communication to welcome suppliers to the platform, provide them with onboarding materials, and then follow up as well. We know that as folks are getting onboarded to a system, maybe things can fall to a bottom of the to-do list. So our outreach team is really here to encourage and engage those suppliers to make sure that they are logging onto the system, sharing their information, and then working to troubleshoot any potential issues. So for example, if suppliers have questions about the task at hand, our supplier outreach team is able to work with them to navigate through those questions, help direct them to actionable responses on the platform, and really develop that partnership with your suppliers so that you all can really focus on kind of that first and last part of the journey, the setting expectations with your suppliers, making sure that you've kind of communicated the importance, and then following up and recalibrating and learning and collecting and looking at that data. So throughout that journey, we'll also be supporting you in setting up webinars and trainings with your suppliers. We cover over 8 different languages in support, which is really useful when you think about the global supply chain, especially those suppliers who are further upstream and may not have as much context or understanding of why they're getting invited to participate. So this is really a way that we can support you all with driving those responses and getting as much data as you can to support in your regulatory or sustainability requirements. That was a high-level overview, but I know we wanted to talk through kind of more some anecdotal and kind of questions as well. So I don't know if, Leo, we want to maybe dive into some of the topics that we had prepared as folks continue to populate the Q&A chat as well.
Sounds good.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll start with one too, because I think one of the important pieces or questions that I always get asked is really, why is it so important to get supplier provided data? Would love if you could kind of touch on that, because I think that really sets the scene and starts us off here.
Happy to, and then I'll ask you some questions about getting in the weeds. But look, broadly speaking, we were doing supply chain mapping a long time before it was required by the law. So it is the fact that the compliance with these due diligence laws requires you to get data from your suppliers, but that's actually not the reason that getting data from your suppliers is so important. So since we've been doing this supply chain mapping and really uncovering the indirect supply chain for companies, the biggest reason that you want to open a channel of communication with your tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers is to affect change, right? Any issue that you identified, whether it's resilience, whether it's quality control, counterfeiting, whether it's environmental issues or social issues in the supply chain, almost none of those issues are going to be addressed directly by your tier 1 suppliers. They're almost always going to be more impactful if you can address them directly at tier 2, 3, 4, etc. So really making change in supply chains means engaging with the indirect suppliers. It's just there's a lot of suppliers that are indirect that you may not have a good database of them, and that's why we built all this technology, was so that companies can improve their supply chains at every tier. And that's the foundation of Sourcemap, is to raise these standards. The reality is getting data from your suppliers, now that it's required by law, and now that we have a cascading portal that's fully automated, is much faster than any other way to map the supply chain. Why? Because if you use AI to map your supply chain, or you use market intelligence data to map your supply chain, you're really casting a very wide net. And then you have to go through the process of canceling out all the noise and the false positives. and it's very time consuming to start out with a huge amount of potential suppliers, and then gradually you have to go to your real suppliers and ask them, but are these really the suppliers that I'm dealing with? So you actually, it's much faster and it builds a lot better relationship with suppliers instead of saying, hey, I looked you up in a database and it says this about you, to go straight to them right away and say, mapping transparency, very important to me, very important to our relationship. Please tell me who you source from. It's going to get you there in hours or days instead of months and months, and build ultimately a strong relationship. There's a few other issues with getting data directly from suppliers, but if most of the issues we have getting data from suppliers stem from technical issues, issues about business processes that haven't been developed yet. So really, if you're not able to map, the answer is not to go around your suppliers and get the data some other way. It's to find out, do they have access to technology? Do they have access to inventory management systems? Do they have access to the internet? There's a whole range of issues. If you get into very specific supply chains, can they do GPS mapping of a farm? Issues like that, where really an expert team that can work with the indirect supplier, discover what the root cause is, of a lack of visibility, and then address it. It takes you way faster than trying to get the data through some sort of a probabilistic approach. So getting the data from suppliers is how you build a positive, productive relationship with them. It's how you actually address the root cause of supply chain risk, in most cases. And then last but not least, it's actually required by the law. So no amount of AI or databases or remote sensing satisfies either the EU sub-supplier mapping requirements or the US sub-supplier mapping. You have to actually get firsthand data that's verifiable from your suppliers directly in order to comply with all of the laws that I mentioned.
Um,
And Carrie, I know by the way, for the sake of everybody in the audience, so you have Carrie here. She's an amazing resource because she has implemented some of the most expansive supply chain mapping platforms ever in the history of the world, and especially in new industries. And we know that once we have many of the companies in the same industry mapping, it goes much faster, and the cost goes down for everyone. But when you're the first in an industry, you're really at the front lines of explaining the value of mapping, of cajoling the suppliers, of understanding what the stumbling blocks are. So Carrie is a huge resource that you all have. So ask her questions in the Q&A and I'll read them to her. I'm really going to spend the rest of our webinar mostly focusing on asking Carrie to download as much of her expertise in this space. First question, I know you addressed it in the slides, but just really important, because we see lots of permutations of this. Who should be in the room at a company that is about to embark on supply chain transparency for the first time? Who are the stakeholders that should really be there when you're gathering the needs, when you're deciding how to go about it, and when you're deciding who's going to support the process going forward?
Yeah, and this is such a critical question because it really sets the tone for the success of your endeavors with supply chain mapping. Oftentimes this type of initiative may start from a legal or compliance perspective, or potentially a sustainability or ESG team. Those may be the folks who have, the driver and the reason to map a supply chain. But it is really, really critical to have the folks who are doing day-to-day business with your suppliers in that room. So whether that's your procurement teams, your supply chain managers, your even responsible sourcing managers, having the folks who have those direct relationships is going to be the most critical to see that ongoing success with your supply chain transparency. They're the ones who are going to be able to hear firsthand from suppliers about, any questions that they may have. They're going to be able to give you that insight into what their day-to-day looks like with the supplier, potential, be able to raise any questions. So it's really important to include those teams. They're going to be able to give you the supplier perspective as you set out to plan your communications, your follow-up, your ongoing improvement. And they're going to be the ones who can support as well. If you have any questions as you're doing the supply chain mapping. So as you're finding out about partners upstream, they're going to be the ones who are going to be able to help you unpack that as well. So having, all the folks in the room who have the business need to get this done, but then also having the folks in the room who have those direct relationships is where I see the most successful implementations, and really having them be a stakeholder to this process, and making sure that you're articulating the value of this process for those folks as well.
Oh, I got to get myself off of mute. Once you've got the right people around the table, it sounds like those are the people who have the suppliers, front of mind, and they have the relationships. They have
Yep.
they have they understand all the nuances, all the incentives, disincentives, and all of that. How do you set expectations with suppliers? And again, I think I want to lean on your expertise here with new industries, because when it's already
Yeah.
established, the response rates are 100%. Everything is hunky dory. But what happens when you have to set expectations for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first off, don't minimize it. This is a really big deal. This is a really big step. Transparent supply chains, especially when in a newer industry, it's a new way of doing things. So really taking it seriously and thinking about the impact that it will have is really important. And then creating your messaging around that too. So if you're in a new industry and your suppliers have not mapped their supply chains before, they're going to want to understand why they're doing this, what that means for their partnership, what are the benefits of it too. And I know a lot of times there's some hesitancy from suppliers around this, but ultimately there's a lot of benefit from overarching supply chain transparency and really making sure that you're able to communicate this as a really important and exciting step as well. Starting off there and then getting more specific. Oh, sorry,
Yeah, and I
Leo,
know
did you have? Yeah.
no, I know firsthand, because we sometimes the suppliers actually become customers because they are saying,
Hmm.
"Hey, I'm doing this for one of my customers. I want to do it for the other ones," or I want to know what the results of the screening are going to be. So let me get a preview, and so then it becomes so we can see that once they understand the value of the mapping, they see it as a net positive in order to access new markets, in order to win new deals.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, is there an expectation that they have to do a lot? Is there an expectation that they should be in constant contact? Like, how do we express the sort of the investment that they should be making?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really simple, actually. It's a lot lower lift than I think a lot of suppliers initially think. Really, at least the way that our system works is all we need, especially when we're thinking about mapping a supply chain, is for a company to register, create their account, and then provide the email contact and the names of the companies that they're working with. We don't want to, overwhelm anyone with collecting a lot of information. That's not what we're here for. We want to establish a map and network of your supply chain, exactly as Leo was saying earlier, so that you can start to screen, understand what your supply chain looks like, and then most importantly, open those lines of communication and those relationships to your upstream partners. So that's why it's so important to get the contact information of your upstream suppliers as well as the business name. But really, it's just as simple as that. When we're talking about supply chain mapping, it's just providing those couple of pieces of information. And in terms of cadence, really that's up to our customers as they kind of grow in their supply chain journey. We never really see this as something where suppliers need to be logged in every second providing information. That's not how supply chain typically works anyway. We're not seeing that folks are switching around suppliers on a day by day basis. So it's really something that we suggest setting an expectation of. You're going to need to come back into the system maybe once a quarter, twice a year, based on the goals, and update your supply chain data or verify that it hasn't changed. And really, that's that's kind of the expectations that we want you to set with your suppliers, that this is something that's going to become part of their business as usual. It's going to be simple for them to provide, and it's something that they can work with their upstream partners as well to complete as well.
And I want to piggyback on that because there's a
Yeah.
question in the chat that I think I can kind of wrap your answer into. But so you're talking about what is essentially, a matter of a few minutes that a supplier spends, especially if they already have an account because they're already answering someone else's request to map. So they come in and they provide a simple list of, which suppliers did they use to supply this customer with these products, for this time period. So it's really, we're talking about a very simple exercise. The question is, how do you cope with regulations that prevent transparency, for example, counter-espionage? And I'll give my answer here, but this process has nothing to do with espionage or in any way singling out any suppliers from any countries. And I think there's been some misinterpretation of some of these regulations, but ultimately, supply chain mapping only works if it's applied broadly. Right? It has to be applied to your global supplier base because guess what? The tier twos, tier threes, and tier fours could be anywhere. So you cannot actually prejudice the mapping to the suppliers in certain countries because they could be buying from any other countries. And when you get there, it's really supply chain mapping, which is a quality control process. It's a brand protection process. It's a sustainability process. So it answers all these questions, and not the least of which is risk and resilience. So it should not be presented in a way that only targets certain regions of the world. It cannot work if it only targets certain regions of the world. And really the way that Sourcemap has conceived of it, um, it is a business practice. It's a next level supply chain management database that needs to be compiled for companies to compete and to have access to the European and the North American market. So we cope with regulations like that by making sure that the mapping is applied in a completely universal way. Uh, you talk about the effort the suppliers put in. How much effort, Carrie, do you want to convey that the companies that are complying with these laws, how much effort should they be putting into the supply chain mapping?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this before as well, but it's almost like a sandwich of, you're at the first part and the last part as well, and then Sourcemap will do the work in the middle. The effort on a company's end is really in that setup, making sure that you have communicated why this is important, setting the scene with your suppliers to make sure that they understand why they're being asked to do this work. And then on the back end as well, that kind of follow through. So understanding, who hasn't responded, maybe why they haven't responded, opening up lines of communication with any suppliers based on items that you've found within your supply chain, and then recalibrating your strategy and that front end communication based on what you've learned through that process. In the middle, the communication is on Sourcemap. So that's where our supplier engagement team really takes on the lift of engaging your suppliers to get them registered and providing that data. So that larger lift of following up, encouraging suppliers to actually take action is on Sourcemap. And really the effort that we ask or suggest is around that strategy, communication, and follow-up from customers.
Yeah, I'm getting so actually kind of a great amount of questions here. So
Oh,
I'm
great.
gonna keep peppering you with them. But because we're gonna dive into the sort of the mechanics of the actual supplier outreach, like what the supplier outreach team does, what happens when something goes wrong, what are the kinds of things that tend to go wrong, and then I'll get into the sort of these questions here, which are
Yeah.
essentially how do we deal with reluctance to answer or issues in data formatting. But I guess maybe to start big, and then I think we're probably going to run into time here. What all does this supplier outreach team? You mentioned that the customer gets involved at launch, and then they get
Yeah.
involved if and when there's an escalation or a renegotiation at the end of the year. But during the year, it's really in the hands of Sourcemap and the supplier outreach team to handle all the supplier communication. So, walk us through a little bit. What are they doing day to day
Yeah.
for our customers?
Absolutely. So like you said, at launch, a customer is going to send out that communication. Right along with that launch, our supplier engagement team is actually hosting webinars to train and invite suppliers on the Sourcemap platform. They're sending out email communications with user guides, the initial context, and the why about this initiative. And then they're starting a cadence of email and phone calls to engage suppliers. So again, our supplier engagement team covers over 8 languages, and they're reaching out to suppliers with approved text, actually by our policy team, that we send out to suppliers to engage them on the platform and remind them to either register and create an account or respond to an open request. They're also doing that reactive support as well. So if suppliers are reaching out with questions about what does this regulation mean, or what is this task that I'm supposed to be doing on the Sourcemap platform, the outreach team is helping to navigate those questions. They're also handling any type of question that comes from a technical standpoint. So, hey, I forgot my password. Hey, how do I access this link? All of that is handled by them as well. And then they're also providing reports of their engagement as well. So if they're receiving kind of questions, feedback from those suppliers, you would have that visibility into what that looks like, while also just trusting that the team is handling that communication. So they're day in, day out talking with suppliers on the platform, whether it's through email, through call, they're engaging with those questions, and they're really trying to move the needle forward, or move the ball forward in terms of responsiveness on the platform.
And I want to just sort of underscore what you're saying, but it sounds like a lot. But the reason it works is that actually the bulk of the supplier outreach team's work is really the first time. The first
Yeah.
time we tackle a new industry, the first time a supplier is invited. And it's not the suppliers, it's really the tier threes,
Yeah.
tier fours, tier fives. They don't know anything, and they may not know. They probably don't know where their products are actually ending up,
Yeah.
let alone that they might be subject to certain regulatory requirements. And so it's really that first
Totally.
outreach when the suppliers have to be contacted. Really, I think less than 10% of suppliers ever have to be contacted by Sourcemap once. Once they're in the platform, once they're getting the regular refresh of their data, they never have to come back in. So the sort of that 92% response rate is out of the box, what the software achieves. Then when when we talk to the suppliers that are those 8%, when we invite them back the second time, it becomes completely automated, and they're no longer needing any of that outreach. So the reason it works is that it's really concentrated uh, on the launch, especially launch to new industries. But once those industries are up and running, the response rate, even down to tier 4 and 5, is 100%, with the only variability is that turnover of those new suppliers that have
Yeah.
never been part of a supply chain mapping platform before.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, we
it,
absolutely see that engagement continue to increase and increase the more you map. And, the biggest hurdle is the first time.
is there I'm getting some bunch of questions around
Yeah.
confidentiality. I just want to zoom out a little bit and say,
Yeah.
okay, Carrie, but you also run a big chunk of customer success at Sourcemap, so you have dozens, if not more, of customer accounts that you oversee. At what point and what level does Sourcemap engage with, let's say, the legal team and the procurement team in the event that there's contracts that need to be adjusted, right? Either because there's
Yeah.
confidentiality in the contract that precluded sharing this kind of data, or because we want to try to build in some sort of pre-screening and a sort of timeliness obligation into future contracts.
Yeah, great question. I see all the questions about confidentiality as well. And I guess even to zoom out a little bit further, we in all of our training as well share our data protection and data privacy policies with suppliers. We know this is a huge concern. So apologies for not mentioning that earlier, but we share that in all of our communications with suppliers. Anything that they're sharing with us is not shared with anyone besides that requesting customer. We really treat their data as so important, and we communicate to suppliers as such as well. But we also, in those cases where suppliers come to us and say, hey, we have a concern about this, we work with our customers to either potentially establish three-way NDAs, work to kind of understand hesitations from that supplier, see how we can kind of backtrack. I honestly will say most of the time it's an initial concern from suppliers, and then once they actually understand what they're being asked to share, which again is, customer name and email, that request for kind of that additional legal language disappears, because it's much less than I think most suppliers expect that they're being asked to share. But we really work with our customers to kind of support in any of those types of questions, and set up additional agreements if needed.
That's right. I forgot IT. Also, IT has
Yes,
security precautions
yes,
that we have to honor, and we always work with IT if and when those come up. Again, to make sure that the data is clearly not personally identifiable information. It's not covered under GDPR, or if it is, it has to be handled in a certain way. So there is a good amount of IT involvement there. I have a look. I think we'll wrap this up kind of quickly, but around the kinds of questions that suppliers have, the kinds of help that they need. There's one question in particular. Do you offer support to producers to collect geolocations? Ensure those are in the right format. This is just one very specific request around EUDR. EUDR is unique because you don't need to register every supplier. You just need to collect the map of the raw material origins, which you can typically do by asking a direct supplier or maybe a tier two. But nevertheless, getting that map is pretty complicated. I don't know if you want to talk to data support that our outreach team offers, and any other
yeah,
support issues that you know of.
yeah. And I mean, this is such a hot topic right now because EUDR is coming very quickly, and it's impacting so many companies across the globe, and it's really asking for a lot of suppliers to provide geolocation data for the first time. And we've been doing this for a while. We've been working with geolocation data polygons for quite some time, so we've have a really robust way of explaining how that data needs to be collected. But we're also now getting a lot of new questions from suppliers as they do this for the first time. So we're kind of constantly calibrating our instructions, our guidance for suppliers based on what we hear from the industry as well, for folks who are doing this for the very first time, to make sure that our guidance is up to date and includes a lot of these questions from newer folks. And we also have baked into our platform actually feedback on any sort of geolocation data that is provided in the context of EUDR. So if a supplier uploads something that is not valid in terms of a polygon, they'll get feedback as to what was wrong with that polygon as well, so that they can kind of take that back and work to correct it. Our supplier engagement team is there to kind of support them in that process. We have a team of GIS engineers and data analysts as well that can provide additional support. But like I said, that supplier engagement team will be that front line of collecting all the questions that we get from suppliers, kind of understanding the new challenges that we'll see as we enter EUDR implementation, and making sure that we're best poised to support those suppliers.
Great. Look, I think we can just about wrap this up with some final thoughts. I know I want to sort of anecdotally, we always use the symbol plus in terms of the languages we speak, because every new customer that has a new geography that needs us to add a member to the outreach team that speaks a different language. I'm thinking in particular a lot of mapping that we had to do in West Africa, and then in sort of Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, where we had to really spread our language capability, but also our digital compatibility. We saw people who needed outreach through WhatsApp, and so our supplier outreach team uses WhatsApp to reach out in certain places. We know that there's some people who don't have a computer handy, and then it's about finding out the neighbor that has a computer, and I know that we've done that in particular with certain supply chains where we really wanted to get every farmer registered. So it's part of what drives people and motivates them to work here, right? It's the problem solving. It's how do we get that visibility? How do we bridge these socioeconomic cultural divides that are in supply chains? And so bring us problems, and it would make us happier than anything to solve them. I know I've had the luck of being in a lot of origin places and discovering how to get the polygons mapped when you don't have the internet connection, and how we validate and aggregate the data when you're completely offline on a laptop in a Jeep and stuff like that. So we've been there every step of the way, and that includes giving the instructions to the field team on what app to install on their phone, and how best to conduct the mapping, and how to get clean data. So we've really been there. We've done that in terms of support, and we're constantly learning. So that team of outreach experts is adding to their script, adding to their playbook every day. For every time there's a new challenge, they jump to the occasion. I don't know if there's anything from the questions we got, Carrie, or any final thoughts that you wanna share with the audience before we sign off.
Yeah, I mean, so many great questions, and I think just a note too that you can always reach out to myself or Leo as well to ask any additional questions. Like Leo said, I have a lot of experience working with customers and implementing this, and I love talking about it. I love problem solving, so always happy to chat. But yeah, I think just again. The partnership with your suppliers is so important to establishing your traceability and transparency journey. And I think the most successful implementations I see always start with having that really important why and that strategy up front, and a really good partnership with Sourcemap supplier engagement team to work to engage those suppliers. But really appreciated the conversation and dialogue today, as well as all of the great questions from the audience. Oh,
Great.
perfect. Yeah.
Same here. Thanks everybody. This is who we are. This is how you can reach us at our personal business emails, and then of course we're happy to work on any issues you may have around your own supply chain mapping and compliance needs. So I think that's gonna be a wrap, but we're gonna make this recording available as well, and send it out to all the attendees. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks, Lexi.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.